tales for dark nights.
The following performance is a third-round entry in the 2016 Evil Idol voice acting competition, and you, the listener, get to help decide who wins. If you'd like to hear more of this contestant, voting for them is simple and only takes a moment. Just click the thumbs up icon. Can't stand them? Then click the thumbs down icon instead, and cast them into the digital netherrealm from whence they came. You decide their fate. Good luck to all of our contestants.
A Fear of Atlas by Nicholas Goroff. Read here on Chilling Tales for Dark Nights by the author. Randall was a man who was growing tired of a great many things. He was tired of his job, of his tiny apartment, of the depressed little city that the two resided in, as well as his failing car, failing relationships, and the sputtering gasps of his dreams and ambitions. As he sat outside in the back of the small restaurant in which he worked as a cook, he inhaled the rancid smoke of his cheap cigarette and sighed as the cloud escaped his lungs. His eyes meandered along the corners and edges of the rear service entrance he had exited through, and the building itself, which it led back into. It seemed as though everything from the door and the building before him, up through the contents of his own life, were all in some state of crumbling decay, either metaphorically, or in the case of the restaurant's rear exterior, quite literally. He knew that inside the burners upon the ovens, as well as those upon the grills, were shoddy and distributed flame unevenly due to their age and corrosion. He knew that the coolers were failing, and that the produce rotations and the questionable increase in adding mystery soup specials to the menus meant simply that management saw the borderline food products they were selling to be a more economical solution than replacing the broken-down equipment. He knew that after work these senses of a breaking-down world would continue to pester him. Were he even to receive a call from Julie, a woman he had been dating casually, yet growing further apart from, it would undoubtedly result in an awkward conversation about plans they may or may not carry through on, leading to an unsurprising dullness if they did, and a furthering divide between them if they did not. As for friends, though he could not specifically put his finger on when such began, it seemed increasingly as though he never spoke to any, or that those few who he could think of had moved on and away some long time ago. Through and through these feelings that the entire universe was in a slow process of decay dogged him from the moment he woke up to whatever times he finally fell asleep. And though he would from time to time attempt to discuss this sense of entropy that he felt, it seemed quite clear, following multiple discussions with co-workers or strangers at the bar, or really anyone who would listen, that he was alone in feeling or observing such. As though it was solely his universe which was falling apart. As he let this sensation linger a moment longer, he stubbed his cigarette on the gritty concrete below, rose from his seat on the ground, and walked back into work, closing the door behind him. No sooner had it latched with him safely inside than did a chunk of concrete break loose from the frame above and fall crashing to the ground. Though his sense of decay in his personal life was certainly a subjective matter, observations about his workplace were facts more solid than the brick, mortar, or concrete which comprised it. The same was true for his home. Stepping around a cracked and crumbling portion of the concrete outer step upon returning home from work, he struggled as he usually did with the key and front door, neither of which seemed too keen to work with the other to allow him entry. As the stairs within his apartment in the front stairwell creaked and groaned as he traversed the 2 flights upwards to his tiny apartment, he wondered how long it would be until one of his feet finally went through one. The lights flickered as he turned them on, now finally home, and the undeniable yet unidentifiable stench of something foul and rotting once again seemed to have made its way into his abode, either through the aging pipes or perhaps something merely dead and decomposing in either the ceiling or floor below his feet. There was a singular bright spot in the midst of such dilapidation, if one could even call it a bright spot, which he struggled with internally from time to time. As his social life and social circles degraded into nothing, he had taken up drinking alone as something of a hobby. Not of the classic sort, wherein a man with a whiskey bottle stares blankly into space, wondering what had become of his life. Randall had recently discovered that so long as he cut through the right sequence of alleyways, he could walk downtown in relatively short time. Upon arriving, he would set about bar hopping, sipping cheap well drinks, and preparing to enjoy the social messes that would evolve following last call. Generally good and drunk by the time this would happen, the shouting matches, tearful make-up sessions, fist-fights, and bar-room romances, which would spill out into the street, provided for Randall a source of short-lived entertainment on most nights. It was, however, on one particular night that his usual route from whiskey bar to tap house to whiskey bar again found itself interrupted by a sight that was unusual in Randall's routine. Walking off of one of the side streets which led to the main drag, he caught nearly immediate sight of an exceptionally beautiful woman. Unlike most others he'd see in town, she lacked the destroyed complexion, the paleness or paltry tones, and generally trashy demeanor which nearly every other woman he'd encountered in town seemed to wear these days. Instead, across the street and staring directly at him was a woman of stunning composure and aesthetic, with fine black hair, a healthy and flawless complexion, and illustrious green eyes. She wore a slinky blue dress, which hugged her hips and shoulders and breasts perfectly, outlining a body fit for a Hollywood starlet. He was forced to stop dead in his tracks upon meeting eyes with her from across the boulevard. In what seemed to last both a split second and eternity, the two stood looking at one another with Randall's face awash in stunned surprise at the sight of such a beauty, and her expression being one of a knowing playfulness. As the moment then passed, she turned and walked into the front door of a nightclub he had never bothered to notice before. Just as she passed through the door, she shot a beckoning look over her shoulder directly at him, to which he found himself drawn irresistibly. Making his way across the street, he shot out directly for the door and stepped inside. Within lay a casual yet sophisticated lounge, with fine furnishings and an overall handsome clientele. He was struck by the generally polished and well-kept environment which seemed to almost defy his entire understanding of the world and city he inhabited. Nowhere was there to be found any cracked windows or walls, nor furniture, fixture, or lighting that was showing any signs of wear or decay. To all of his senses, a wholeness of construction and composition was found, with everything from the soft sounds of polite conversation and background lounge jazz to the sense of perfumes, fine meals, and exotic cocktails permeating every corner of the place. And as though by some spectacular design, at what seemed to Randall to be at the center of it all, there at the bar, unaccompanied, sat his mystery woman. Sipping daintily on a drink of green as resplendent as her eyes, she glanced over to him from over her shoulder, before returning her gaze once again to the glass below. Bewildered and bewitched, Randall made his way to her, and took a seat beside her at the bar. He began, trying not to stumble too hard on words which simply wouldn't come. "It's nice to see you again, Randall," said the woman, still focused upon her drink. He was, to put it mildly, dumbstruck, and it began furiously pouring through his mind, trying to recall the apparently forgotten time he'd met this beauty before him. I know you're struggling to recall who I am, so I suppose I'll introduce myself once again. I am Memory. This time she set her drink down as she spoke and looked Randall dead in the eye. So we know each other? He asked in utter bewilderment. She offered him a sincere and friendly laugh. We do. We've actually met a few times. I'm sorry, he stammered. I really can't imagine what would cause me to forget someone like you. You most likely just had a lot on your mind since then. Sometimes people can forget things, so they can keep enough room in their minds to keep things running smoothly. He was entirely baffled by her answer, and continued searching through every mental nook and cranny he could find in a desperate bid to recall their meeting. Though try as he might, nothing came. I think I might have been a blonde last time, to be honest, she said, again returning to her drink but maintaining eye contact as she did. Her suggestion did nothing to help him recollect, and instead only served to drive him ever so slightly madder for his forgetfulness. He was about to speak then, and offer up some paltry apology while then seeking to divert the conversation to more friendly and possibly flirtatious places, when she suddenly asked him a rather strange question. Randall, are you familiar with the concept of solipsism? He was again baffled, this time at both the sudden pivot in their discussion, as well as by the vain attempt on his own part to recall the meaning of a word he knew he had learned, once before at least, but could not define. Wordlessly he shook his head. It's the idea that in life you can never actually know for certain if anyone else is real, as you only actually have your own experience and perspective to draw upon. She sipped her cocktail again. The thinking being that since I am and will always only ever be me, and you are and will only ever be you, that neither of us will ever be able to be 100% certain that the other is real in the same way that we are. What do you think of that? He had not been prepared for a philosophical discussion with such a beautiful woman, let alone seemingly any discussion at all. However, thinking on it for a moment, he soon responded as best as he could. Well, I know for my part that today I got up, went to work, came home, and then came out here. So my day certainly happened. And looking at you now, I can see that you clearly took some time picking out that gorgeous dress, and applying your makeup and fixing your hair, so you're at least offering me some evidence that you were existing and doing things before we met each other here. So I'd say the odds are rather good we're both very real, right? Memory smiled warmly. That's the spirit. She turned quickly to motion to the bartender, whose attention it seemed as though she already had, either by luck or something else. A moment later, as she was once again facing Randall and smiling a smile that simply melted him through and through, the barkeep arrived at their seats and placed 2 shots of what looked like pale whiskey on the bar. Nodding silently then, he took his leave, and Memory picked up the 2 glasses. Handing one to Randall, she raised her own in something of a toast. Drink up. It's West Cork, your favorite. How did you... he began, but found himself cut off as she motioned for him to follow suit. Raising his own glass, the 2 toasted and shot their whiskey. It went down incredibly smooth, and though he could not recall ever having had that brand of what was clearly Irish whiskey, he found without a doubt or reservation that it was in fact his favorite. His confusion deepened and deepened even more as he watched Memory rise from her seat and gesture for him to do the same. He quickly complied, and his beautiful companion then, with a look of genuine happiness and sincerity, took his hands in her own. It was very, very good to see you again, Randall. It always is. Oh, what do you mean Again, Randall found his words cut short. This time, it was due to memory leaning in and kissing him deeply. He closed his eyes. The softness of her lips and the silky smoothness of her skin was complemented so fully by her illustrious and somewhat exotic scent that all thought left Randall in that moment, which seemed to stretch out endlessly, and then end abruptly all too soon. He had heard and read of kisses which made the earth seem to shake and quiver. However, as memory withdrew and his eyes began to open, he caught only the briefest glimpse of her face before the lights flickered and went out. Her hands left his, and the ground felt as though it literally rumbled as they did. Then suddenly, in the dark, Randall felt an overwhelming sense that he was alone. Before he could speak and call to her in the dark, lights flickered and came on once again. However, now instead of the soft lighting of the jazzy, ritzy lounge he had just been standing in, Randall stood instead beneath the stark and harsh fluorescent lights of an empty and dilapidated concrete room. All sounds of music and conversation were replaced by the industrial buzz of the ceiling-mounted lighting, and periodically, the echoing sound of his feet scraping along the concrete floor as he looked all about in absolute shock. For the briefest of moments, Randall was worried that he had gone mad. When the lights themselves began to flicker once more and go out, this time in sequence from the far end of the room, this worry became a sense of abject terror, which caused him to turn sharply on his heel and bolt for what was now a cracked glass and metal shop door leading back out into the street. With every step he took, the darkness felt closer, and though he could not explain why, the very concept of such creeping darkness filled him with an indescribable sense of dread. He needed to make it out. As his hand fell upon the push bar of the disused shop door, he found it locked, and scrambled then to turn the small latch handle. Though he heard the bolt fall away, the door would not budge, and the darkness was nearly upon him. From the back of the large empty room, he heard what sounded to him like something massive and heavy collapsing, thunderously in the dark. His terror deepened then, and as the falling blackness raced closer to him, he threw his shoulder into the door, shattering some bits of glass out of it, which went spilling into the ground outside. Thankfully, though, it proved enough to dislodge the frame and allow Randall to escape out into the sidewalk. No sooner had he dashed out into the sidewalk, throwing closed the now partially broken glass door behind him, than did the same rumble and thunder which had been heard in the shadows before seem to rush up from the back of the room, growing louder from behind the door as it did. Randall stepped back, terrified as the sound reached a crescendo, and from the broken bits of window spewed a merciless cloud of dust, as though a bomb had gone off inside. Standing there, afraid to his very core, and now covered in concrete dust, he looked stupefied at the sight which greeted him as the dust slowly cleared. No longer a polished pub exterior as it had been when he walked in, Randall saw instead a darkened and condemned storefront, which looked as though it had been empty and abandoned for years potentially. Within the storefront windows, which were themselves covered in municipal signage declaring the property private, as well as tape covering vast webs of cracks, he watched as the grey dust that had chased him out swirled about. All about him to either side, dumbfounded gawkers and onlookers stared at the terrified, dust-covered man. One spoke up. "Dude, were you in there?" a young man asked, astonished at the sight of him. Then another spoke as well. "Are you crazy? Buddy, that place has been condemned and slated for demolition for months now," said an older, gruffer onlooker with a husky voice. Randall tried to speak, but could not find the words. The shock and horror of such an impossible experience as he had just been through had rattled him too deeply to speak. He stumbled back a few steps, alternating his gaze between the abandoned shop front and the bystanders who looked at him with equal astonishment and confusion. It was upon, though, his third time looking to the others, that another sudden horror presented itself. He could not be sure, for he bolted once more as soon as he saw, but upon looking once more to the strangers which surrounded him, their expressions had changed from the ordinary confusions of people unsure of what had happened, to the dead and expressionless looks which kept attention trained on him despite no longer having eyes to see. They looked more like dead things then, all gazing from empty eye sockets, their pale faces all dropped and agape. Randall shrieked in terror and stumbled again as he began to run. Though they did not give chase, he ran a mad dash down the sidewalk towards a nearby intersection, and as his foot fell upon the curb, the stone beneath him came loose and crumbled to dust, sending him spilling into the street head first. Falling to the concrete, he felt his head bash against the hard street surface, and picking himself up, felt the warm trickle of blood begin to fall down his face. His vision was blurred, and his head rang out in pain. Yet the terror stayed with him, and he was soon up again and running once more. After another block he watched as a taxicab rolled by, and screaming to the cabbie, he waved his arms frantically. By some grace of good luck, the red lights of the cab's brake lights shone out, and the car came to a stop. Randall, with every possible ounce of energy within him, scrambled in through the door into the back seat and quickly slammed and locked it behind him. Glancing over his shoulder, he noticed he was not being pursued. "Where to, buddy?" the cabbie asked in a hoarse voice that croaked out the words more than speaking them. Gasping and out of breath, Randall answered, "Home, Merrimack Street, 188. 188 Merrimack Street." "188 Merrimack. Off we go," the cabbie croaked as the car began to roll along. After a block, Randall began to calm down ever so slightly. Still panting and afraid, he began to feel somewhat as though he would be safe, as he was now on his way home, away from the dead things and the darkness he wasn't entirely certain he had actually seen. It was when the sudden and unexpectedly violent bumps and jostles came from the cab, hitting what felt like tremendous potholes, that his blood pressure shot up once again. Glancing out the back window, he saw that they were indeed traversing a veritable minefield of crumbling holes in the street, which seemed to him to be growing and sinking deeper as they passed over them. He had both walked and driven that street many times and knew full well where he was, but he had never, in all the crumbling city, seen something so destroyed as the street he had strolled down less than an hour before. A string of confused and hushed profanities escaped his lips, causing the cabbie to speak to him over his shoulder. "Yeah, the city is falling apart, I tell you," he croaked. "Don't worry, though. We're almost there." Randall didn't spare a glance back around as the cabbie spoke, as his attention was fixated on what now appeared to be outright sinkholes, swallowing the most distant potholes that they had run over. The holes in the street were indeed expanding, and were now beginning to swallow up portions of the curb. Panic began setting in even deeper than before. A few moments later, the cab, with squealing brakes in clear need of service, stopped just outside of Randall's building. He scrambled out of his seat, not even thinking to pay, until he heard the croaking voice of the cabbie call out, "Hey, that'll be $8.50, pal." Stopping in his tracks, he turned and hastily returned to the cab, leaning down and looking in through the open passenger window. As his hand shot into his pocket in search of his wallet, his eyes looked up and were struck by the sight of the aging and worn cabbie's face, now vacant and seeming to deflate before him. His eyes had sunken deep into his skull, and his flesh began to sag upon it as though he was decomposing right there before him. Randall's own face contorted and dropped in horror, as from beneath the sagging and pallid visage of his driver, he saw what almost looked to be a smile beneath the eyeless sockets form up. In a voice that had now gone from a croak to an awful wheezing moan, the dead thing behind the wheel spoke. "No, what? Don't worry about him. Life is too short not to take the free ride." No sooner had the final words escaped the collapsing face than did the smile broaden just a bit before the diminishing form of the man collapsed onto the seat, sinking further until nothing remained but a pile of foul, threadbare clothing. Aghast and confused at what he had just witnessed, Randall stepped slowly back, grappling with the vision of the decaying man who had just died and disappeared before him. As his steps brought him closer to the crumbling front stoop, a sinkhole opened up beneath the rear wheels of the taxi, sending its front end lurching upward as the car was swallowed up by the street. He felt a rumble and a cracking in the sidewalk below him, and darted up the steps, fumbling with his keys before finally giving up and shouldering the rotted front door open. He dashed up the stairs, finding his foot sailing clean through one on the second flight, almost causing him to tumble back down. Regaining his balance, he rushed up to his door and once again threw his shoulder into it, shattering the hollow plywood into splinters which flew about his living room. The apartment was dark, and the lights refused to work. The pale orange glow of the street lamps flickered as they crept in through the windows. Going to one, he looked down into the street only to find the whole of it falling into one darkened sinkhole after another, until there was nothing left and the curb and streetlights themselves began to sink as well. Lifting his gaze to the city horizon, he watched in horror as the skyline itself shifted and moved. Entire buildings, dozens of stories tall, listed and fell one by one, and a tremendous rumbling filled his ears. As the lights began to go out all around the city, and the whole of the world was plunged into darkness, the terrifying realization that the world was ending set in. Still partially and almost hopefully questioning if he was not merely going mad, his knees suddenly felt weak, and he shuffled backwards, coming to sit upon his bedside, his eyes still fixed on the darkness and destruction which was taking place out of his window. It was then that the next shock came. "Randall," said a woman's voice from beside him, "it's time again to remember." His eyes whipped around to his side inconceivably fast, and as they did, his gaze was torn from a vision of horror and dread to one of beauty and utter serenity. Her green eyes, though serious, were still warm and inviting. He could not explain how memory had arrived, nor how or why he was so happy to see her, but in that moment her face became his salvation. Memory, what is going on?" he stammered, terrified and desperate for answers. "You're remembering, Randall. It's almost upon you. Just stay with me." As she spoke, she took his hands again, and the two sat together, their eyes locked on the other's. His breath began to slow then, as a sense of calm rose over him. Alongside this rising calm, the light waned and gave way to darkness, with the last thing he could see being Memory's beautiful green eyes. There they sat in the dark then, together. Soon the thunderous sound of the end of the world subsided. All the light was gone, and so too was the sound. As moments passed, time itself seemed to change, first stretching out in a way which caused seconds to span for minutes, and seemingly hours. Soon then, time vanished entirely, as did the feeling of the bed beneath him and the room around him. Following this, his very sense of self and being became diluted and then vanished. Though now beyond physicality entirely, something in him still felt her presence. Though neither had hands any longer to hold, they still sat with such clasped together. Without eyes to see, they still gazed at one another, and in that boundless, incorporeal moment that was itself a matter of forever and never at all, Randall found his memory. Randall remembered. It had always been in fact just this: darkness, silence, formlessness. The darkness was not merely around him, but was him, and was the darkness and the nothingness which seemed at all times existed behind and beneath everything. It was in that darkness that he first created the very sense of self, which led in time to a created sense of boredom and lonesomeness. It had been from his darkness that he had emerged, and from himself that the darkness had emerged, and feeling incomplete between those two as being one and the same, he desired light and company. This desire began then to create a self, separate from the dark, and then within the void which now simply surrounded him, there grew from his desire other things. Beds upon which to lie and streets upon which to walk. Trees and buildings and sunrises and moonlit skies all unfolded themselves from his desire and imagination. Then after these came birds and mice and cattle, and other things that walked and fed. These things which fed then soon became autonomous and inspired the creation of other life that thought and acted for itself. Life which could speak, and which would fill his new world with tragedy and comedy, and help him escape the lonesome darkness entirely. Once the life was brought into the new world of light and being and action and activity, there was but one final thing to do for the experience to be complete, and so he forgot and said goodbye to his memory, knowing that she would seek him out once again. For it was his memory which remained the final piece of his reality that he needed gone for his life to begin and begin again. Knowing that her presence would inevitably bring his world crashing down with the realization that it was only as real as he allowed it to be, they parted ways. Not once or twice, but countless times, in a cycle that was once again familiar to him, and once again brought him a sense of despair. As he returned then to his formlessness and darkness, his memory spoke to him without words or voice, separate from himself, but still within. "We can begin again, however you may desire," she said from within the void. "I will always need to return to you, and will always do such when the time is right." "Why must there be a time at all?" he responded, himself shapelessly from within the nothing. "For you to ask that of yourself would mean you already know from whence the answer comes. You are the only source for any question and the only source for any answer. Begin again when and how you will. As always, I will find you once again, and once again, beginning and end will be one and the same." He thought of nothing then for a good long while. Then, feeling the time was right, things began again. He began this time by forgetting. Randall, now taking the name of Sam, opened his eyes as the morning sun filled his bedroom. The light stung slightly as the knowledge of what he was became the knowledge of being Sam. Stretching and rubbing his eyes, Sam sat up in bed and looked out into the bright and perfect world, ready to begin yet another day. From beside him, the murmur of a waking woman's voice told him that it was time to make some coffee. As she turned over, her emerald green eyes fluttered. With a deep and satisfied breath, she sat up beside him and smiled. Looking over to her, he smiled in kind and spoke. "Good morning, Memory. What would you like to do today?"
Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, don't forget to cast your vote for this contestant via either a thumbs up or thumbs down vote. By doing so, you'll help us determine who will become the next permanent member of our voice acting team. At the close of voting on September 23rd, based on your votes, the top 5 contestants will progress to the 4th and final round to take place live on October 31st at our annual Halloween live stream event, based entirely on your votes. Thank you for voting and for helping to spread the word. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm Steve Taylor, host of Chilling Tales, the podcast, encouraging you to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.